Well, shalom lekulam. Hello to everyone, and welcome to our Bible study on the book of Genesis. And today, for this video, we are going to be in chapter 11. So, just to kind of set the stage for Genesis chapter 11, let's go through our PowerPoint material. I still like to use this second dispensation, the age of conscience chart, because it kind of puts things in chronological perspective. At the left side of this chart, we have the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, but it is going to be from them that the red ribbon of redemption and salvation is going to go through their families. They had any number of sons and daughters, but the famous ones are these: Cain, Abel, and Seth. And we're told in Genesis that Cain and Abel came to worship the Lord. Cain's offering was not accepted because it was like a grain offering. Cain was a farmer, so he brought the fruits of the field with him. Abel was a shepherd, so when he came to worship, the sacrifice he brought was the first fruits of his flock. And because that involved a blood sacrifice, God accepted that. And the reason he accepted that was because it was predictive in a prophecy sense. It was typological of the ultimate salvation that God would provide through his son, Yeshua HaMashiach, or Jesus Christ. Afterwards, at some point after that worship time, Cain and Abel were together out in the field, and Cain slew his brother Abel. He put him to death. I was going to say that's the first death recorded in Scripture, but I'm not going to say that. It seems to be the first one recorded, but it may not be the first death involved, because we have the rebellion of Lucifer, who later becomes Satan, even before the 6 days of creation, or probably more accurately, it should be called the recreation or the restoration of the earth to a habitable state. So after Abel passed away, then Seth was another son of Adam and Eve. And because Cain was wicked, he was an unbeliever, he did not do worship the right way, the line of redemption or salvation does not go through his family. It would have gone through Abel's family, but because he passed away, Seth took his place. And so the red ribbon of salvation and redemption goes through the descendants of Shet, or Seth. Over many generations here brings us to the story of Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we have the whole thing about these sons of God intermarrying with the daughters of women and creating a race of giants, the Nephilim, in Genesis chapter 6. But that brings us to the pre-flood stuff, but we see storm clouds on the horizon here. So there's the great flood of judgment at Noah's time. The one thing I like to point out about the age of conscience is that it's replaced by the next age, which we will see in just a moment. But conscience continues to be one of the prime vehicles, I guess we would call it, that God uses to communicate with people. Everybody has experienced a guilty conscience, but God communicates with people not just to make them feel guilty about their sins, but also to guide and direct them, to encourage them, to express his love for them, and so forth. So even though the age of conscience comes to an end with the flood of Noah's Ark, conscience is still a primary method of God's communication. And I'll remind you once again that the Bible doesn't begin to be written until about 1500 BC, or BCE if you prefer. So there's about 2,500 years of Earth's history where conscience is going to be the main means of communication. And there's between, all throughout the book of Genesis up until Exodus 20, I guess it would be, there's a lot of communication that takes place between God and man, conversational communication, very detailed communication. It's not just kind of touchy-feely impressions that we get in that sense. It's a rather very, involved and detailed means of communication. Of course, God can communicate in other ways too, with manifestations of his presence and theophanies or Christophanies, pre-incarnate appearances of God in various shapes and forms and so forth. So that brings us to the beginning of Noah's Ark. Then here we have the aftermath of Noah's Ark and God's covenant with Noah. It's actually it's a covenant with Noah. The diet of human beings changes. The meat of animals is added to that diet, which up until that time had been vegetarian. And then we have Noah's three sons. We've got Ham. We're told in Scripture that he's the youngest, and then Shem does seem to be the middle child, and Japhet the oldest. There's a passage that we looked at before that refers to Japhet the elder, which seems to imply that Japhet was the oldest son, but some people try to make that reference to the eldest being a reference to Shem. I think that's a little more awkward in the grammar. So anyway, Shem is the son through which the red ribbon of redemption runs. So one of the things that you may have noticed is, and let me go back to this, the tendency of human beings seems to be to congregate rather than spreading out. After the sin of Cain and so forth, all of his descendants, go out in this direction, and Seth's descendants go out in that direction, but they all seem to congregate in, local areas rather than being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth, which implies dispersion. Well, we see the same thing happening here, which I think implies that there is still a tendency for sinfulness and congregation of different people groups. Ham is, his descendants basically populated the African and Arabian continents. Shem, the middle son, populates Assyria, and we'll say Mesopotamia, kind of out to the Persian Gulf. They are the Semites or the Shemites. That's where the term Semitic comes from. And then Japhet and his descendants eventually will populate Asia Minor, which is Turkey, modern day Turkey, and then the European continent. But initially, in the immediate aftermath of the flood, they tend to congregate, and they seem to congregate around the area of Babylon, where Nimrod settled and built cities there, built kingdoms there. A lot of technical development happened there, kind of revolutionary things. We're going to learn about one revolutionary thing that occurred during the incident of the Tower of Babel, or Babel. It's Bavel in Hebrew. The middle B is pronounced as a V. It's like a soft sounding B sound. So it's Bavel. And I want you to look at the architecture of Alfred Ede, who is the author and artist of this chart, this book of charts that I'm using. This is what he thought the Tower of Babel looked like. Now, I don't know if he thought it actually looked like that, or if this is just kind of a symbolic representation of the tower. And one thing that the chart shows here is it looks like a demolition of the Tower of Babel, towards the top layers of it. But I think that's contrary to scripture. I don't think chapter 11 indicates that God destroyed the Tower of Babel as depicted here. I could be wrong about that. So when we get to that part of the narrative today, we'll see if God destroyed the tower or if the people just stopped building it. Before I started on this video, I went online and just looked for images, pictures of the Tower of Babel. And there are a lot of artist concepts that look like this. And of course, you got kind of a cylindrical shape here. You've got inclined stairways that go up and up and up to the top of the tower. And we'll talk a little bit about the architecture of the tower in a few minutes here. But I do want you to be aware that, what I should have mentioned before is this is called the Age of Human Government. Prior to this period after the flood of Noah's Ark and up until the time of Abraham, God innovated a new method, I guess you would call it, of executing his laws and enforcing his will. Prior to that time, he had taken care of that himself. Like if somebody needed to be killed, God killed them. If somebody needed to be punished for sins, God punished them. So he kind of handled that himself. And he gave assurances to people like Adam and Lamech and the grandson of Ham, Canaan, that, there would be a certain divine protection over them, I suppose, just to accomplish God's purposes and so forth. But after the flood of Noah's Ark, and in connection with the Noahic covenant, or God's covenant with Noah, he institutes a human government. So certain people would be authorized by the general population to become very knowledgeable of God's will and his laws, and to be given the authority by the population to execute those laws, to punish criminals, and to execute the death penalty in cases of illegality where that was the appropriate punishment. So once again, the age of human government comes to an end with the story of Abraham, but human government continues, just like conscience continued in the future dispensations. So yeah, here's a depiction of the Tower of Babel. And then after the Tower of Babel, you'll notice that the people are not congregating together, but they're spreading out and populating the different continents, not planets, continents. So yeah, and we'll notice also here that Palestine is a name for the promised land. It's not the biblical name for the promised land. Palestine is kind of a thorn in my flesh because there never has been a nation of Palestine. It was a name given to the promised land, or the land of Israel, by the Romans when they conquered Israel. And they named it, in Hebrew, the word Palestine is Palishtim, from which we get the Philistines in the Old Testament. So the Romans, after they conquered the Jews, they named their promised land Palestina, I suppose, which is a reference to the Philistines, the ancient enemies of Israel. So that's kind of the chart work that we'll be involved in today. Just a reminder, this is kind of a photo of a portion of a page from the Scofield Reference Bible, which gives us kind of a good explanation for the third dispensation, that of human government. I'm not going to read through this with you. If you would like some time to read through this, I encourage you to pause the video and read through it. There's also a description of the details of the Noahic covenant. Same. If you want to read that, pause the video and read through that. Like I mentioned earlier, these are some photos from these are some photos, but they're artist concepts of what the Tower of Babel looked like. This one on the main screen here is a picture of the Tower of Babel produced by Answers in Genesis, which may be familiar to some viewers. Answers in Genesis is the organization that is, I think it was founded by Ken Ham. He is a young Earth theorist. He believes the Earth is only 6,000 years old. But his real focus in his ministry is to focus on the book of Genesis, which is a good place to focus, especially for questions regarding origins, creation and things like that. It's a ministry that does a good job of equipping people to deal with the theory of evolution as it's taught in public schools in my country, in the United States. It is against the law for public school teachers to teach about creation. So if parents want their children to learn about creation, they have to go to private schools, non-public schools. So this is the Ken Ham. Oh, by the way, the Ken Ham ministry is also connected to the model of the Ark that's built in Kentucky, just south of the Ohio River. Which is an excellent place to visit. You'll learn a lot about the Bible, especially the book of Genesis, if you visit the Ark. You'll learn a lot about the Ark, too. So that's the Answers in Genesis depiction. Here in the lower right-hand corner, I've got an artist's concept of a ziggurat. But this ziggurat is not just kind of what would you call it? It's not. There are archaeological remains of ziggurats left. So if you go to Mesopotamia, and I think there are similar buildings that are the remains of them are in South America. So anyway, this is what a ziggurat looked like based on actual archaeological evidence. And it looks quite similar to the Answers in Genesis artist's impression. And so that should tell you that a lot of Bible scholars, they read through the description of the Tower of Babel, and they have come to the conclusion that it was actually a ziggurat. As opposed to Alfred Eads' thing here. This is kind of a fanciful example. I don't think that's what the Tower of Babel looked like. This is based on archaeological evidence, but that's not to say that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. It may have been something else. The one other thing that I want to highlight on this screen is in the lower left-hand corner here. I have an artist's concept of the New Jerusalem, which is described in Revelation chapters 21 and 22, the last two chapters of the Bible. And here again, you just have to use what few details are given of this city to try to come up with a picture or a artistic image of what the New Jerusalem looks like. Some people have taken the dimensions that are given in Revelation, and they have come to the conclusion that the New Jerusalem will actually be a cube-shaped structure. According to the dimensions given in Revelation, it is 1,500 miles long on each side, 4 sides on each side. And it is also 1,500 miles in altitude, in elevation. So the cube idea of the New Jerusalem looks like the Borg from Star Trek, which was kind of a cube-shaped thing, you know, going around in outer space that the Starship Enterprise encountered now and then. And the Borg, of course, were the enemies of the Starfleet, I guess. I'm not a Trekkie, so I don't know much about Star Trek, but I have seen pictures of the Borg, and it looks like that. The other popular notion is that it is pyramid shaped, so it could still be 1,500 miles high, but it would be slanted on the sides. So there would be different levels or terraces going up, which is sort of depicted here. But it would be pyramid shaped and very high in the sky, like I say, about 1,500 miles. Now, when we talked about the 6 days of creation, we talked about the rakia, which is the atmosphere. That's a Hebrew word for the firmament or the expanse, which seems to be the atmosphere around the earth. And if you look at some diagrams and some statistical details about the atmosphere that surrounds the earth, it goes up, I think it's about 1,800 miles high. So it's a little higher than the New Jerusalem, but it gives you a perspective. It gives you you know, some idea of the size of the New Jerusalem. Now, this building here is nowhere near the size of the New Jerusalem. So I show you the New Jerusalem specs of the New Jerusalem for the sake of comparison. But one of the suggestions that I'm going to make is that when the Tower of Babel began to be built, it may be that God had provided the people who took on that construction project, he may have given them some kind of a idea of what the New Jerusalem looks like. And I think the New Jerusalem and the third heaven, or the Father's house with many mansions, the place where God lives, are the same thing. So one of the possibilities is that when the people undertook the building of the Tower of Babel, they may have had in mind building a tower that was 1,500 miles long on a side and would eventually be 1,500 miles high. Why build it that high? Because if that is the floor level of the third heaven, then for the tower to physically reach that height, then it would have to be 1,500 miles high. Now, for one thing, they couldn't have made it that high because human beings, mere mortals, cannot survive in those upper levels of the atmosphere. Used to fly airplanes for a living, and above 14,000 feet, you've got to have oxygen on, or you'll die. You'll die of oxygen starvation. So physically speaking, they could not have accomplished that. So when they say, you know, they were going to build a tower that reaches to the heavens, it was not possible for them to reach a 1,500-mile altitude. They had some new construction methods that we'll talk about. But I guess the point I want to make is I don't think God was threatened by human beings being able to build a structure that would reach to where he lives, and then maybe trying to take over and, you know, rule the universe from the third heaven or from the New Jerusalem. While it, you know, would not have been physically possible, The people may have thought it was possible, you know, that as long as they've got this great construction materials, they can build as high as they want, and they would have just kept building and building and building until they come up with a New Jerusalem. So that's a possibility. What most Bible scholars think is that this structure at the top of the Tower of Babel, or this structure at the top of this ziggurat, was actually a worship facility. So rather than building a building designed to reach up to heaven, they built a building that was going to bring heaven down to them in the form of worship. And, you know, maybe the one true God would come down and be a part of their worship, or maybe whatever gods they worshiped, like the gods of Nimrod, you know, that those gods would be worshiped. So one of the things that I think we kind of need to decide is what made God angry about the Tower of Babel. Was it that he felt threatened because, you know, these people were trying to build a tower that would reach to heaven? Now, he knew about the oxygen starvation thing, but it may have been the attitude of the people that thought they could build a tower that would reach to where God was. That it was the attitude rather than the, you know, the actual physical task of building the tower that bothered him. I think the thing that bothered him was that the people were congregating in one place, Bavel, and whenever you have large populations congregating in a small area, that's what cities are all about. But that's where all the sin takes place. That's where all the violence takes place. So if you look at the country that I live in, where's all the crime? Where's all the murder taking place? Now, that's not to say that murder doesn't happen in small towns or in rural areas. But I mean, Chicago is noteworthy. It's like the murder capital of the world, and New York, and, you know, big cities in California, and things like that. The Bible makes me kind of want to steer clear of big cities. I was raised in a big city, did ministry in one big city in the northern part of Chicago. So, you know, I think one principle of government is the more local government is, and the smaller government is, the better it is. The larger government becomes, it does tend to congregate in big cities. It attracts people to big cities, and it produces a lot of sinfulness, Okay, I think enough on the Tower of Babel. So we're about a half hour in, so let's take a look at the text and see what it has to say. So Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. The word language here is safa in Hebrew. That is the word for a lip. There's another significant term in Hebrew called, it's the term lashon, which is the word for a tongue. So this is one of the two Hebrew words that involves the mouth, which is like the external speech device, I guess you would say. That's where our ability to speak comes out. Both of these words, safa and lashon, and I think it's kalos. Yeah, it's kalos in Greek, in our Septuagint. But safa and lashon, since we're talking about the Hebrew Bible here, those are both also words for language. If you're familiar with the New Testament and spiritual gifts like those that manifested on the first Christian day of Pentecost, one of the gifts, in fact, the prominent one on the day of Pentecost, was the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues. And yeah, so actually the Greek word for that is glossa. Glossa is the Hebrew word for language, and then the the full term used for speaking in a language, in a glossa, is glossolalia. The lalia part means to speak a language. And it turns out on the day of Pentecost that the languages that were spoken were known human languages, because people from all different regions and different languages were able to interpret what was spoken there. So I've always been kind of uncomfortable with the term speaking in tongues, although that it's technically correct. I would much prefer an English translation of speaking in languages, maybe known human languages, maybe angelic languages, maybe heavenly languages. These are languages that are given by God and unknown to the speaker, kind of by definition. Speaking in tongues has to be that way. So we're talking about languages and speech. Davar in Hebrew is the root word for this, and it means word or speech. So we're talking about the speech, the languages of the earth. It was all one. The whole earth had one language. Now, if we go over here to Dake's Study Bible, he starts out this little paragraph with an interesting statement. It says, there are evidences that Hebrew was the original language of the whole earth. And that's not just because Finest Dake likes the Bible and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. It's because there really are evidences. We have seen the significance of names in the genealogies. We have seen the significance of, like, the names of animals, the names of places. These all have significance to the story, to the details of the story, like the physical details of the stories, but only in the Hebrew language. There's no other language that gives significance to these names. So, like, if you read the Bible and you try to give an English significance to the name Methuselah or Jacob or David or something like that, there is no English significance, but there's tremendous significance in the Hebrew language. So that's one good reason for that. So the Hebrew language may have been the first language, but then the languages are going to be, spoiler alert, the languages are going to be confused. So all these foreign languages that are foreign to Hebrew, develop in the different areas as God scatters the people around. God used it to give his revelation in the Old Testament to man, and Christ used it when speaking to Paul through although the apostle knew Greek well. And these Bible verses are just the places where Jesus, the risen Lord Jesus Christ, spoke to Paul in dreams and visions and through his conscience. And they state that he spoke in Hebrew. So look in the information window down at the bottom of the screen, Acts 21, verse 40. Jesus spoke to them. Oh, that's Paul speaking in Hebrew to the Jewish people. Let's see, I heard them speak in the Hebrew language. They all kept quiet. That's the same story. 26:14. Let's see, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language. There's the one where Jesus is speaking to Paul, also known as Saul of Tarsus. I heard a voice speaking to me and saying, in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, before we leave the subject of languages, there is significant documentary evidence from antiquity, from the biblical era, that certain books of the New Testament, maybe all of the books of the New Testament, but references to certain of those books, were written in Hebrew first and then translated into Greek. Matthew is the one that almost all the early church fathers said that Matthew was written first in Hebrew and then later translated to Greek. And there's also reference to Paul's epistles being first written in Hebrew and translated into Greek, and that's a large portion of the New Testament. There's some documentary evidence also that the book of Hebrews in the New Testament was written in Hebrew first and then translated into Greek. So that's the language thing, and Hebrew seems to be the dominant language here. Verse 2, it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, And remember, after Noah's Ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, they traveled east. The family of Noah traveled east, and go back and take a look at our chart, and you'll see that Shem, Ham, and Japheth all kind of gravitated together. They didn't spread through those various continents, as is going to happen at the end of this chapter, but they all kind of conglomerated around Bavel, which was the region that Nimrod was a significant personage in the east. So they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. I had a map in the last PowerPoint for chapter 10, and I should have left it up so we could look at a map and I could show you where the plain of Shinar is and where Bavel is. And at the end of the chapter, I think we'll talk about Ur of the Chassidim, or Ur of the Chaldees. It's down by the Persian Gulf. It's where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers empty into the Persian Gulf. So I'll try to remember to put a map in the next video. Okay, Genesis 11:3. Then they said to one another, that is these descendants of Noah's sons gathered together in Bavel. Babylon was a prominent city there in the numerous regions that Nimrod established and ruled over them. Kingdoms are referred to in Genesis 10. So then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. This is a revolution in the construction of buildings. Prior to this, and archaeological evidence bears this out, the preferred method of building a structure, like if you wanted to build a house or something like that, what you would do is you would pile rocks on top of each other, and these rocks are going to be variously shaped and things like that, but you're going to pile up rocks and build a wall, and then to hold those rocks together, you're going to want to use some kind of a material that's going to kind of bind those rocks together so they don't just fall apart. And that is going to be like some kind of, probably make mud and, pack it in around the rocks and stuff like that. And to kind of glue them together in a way. But as you can imagine, you'd be very limited in the elevation you could build a building by using that method. By using rocks, and I'm not talking about rocks that are cut in blocks. I'm talking about just rocks that are kind of round shaped. And then you pack mud around those. The higher you go, of course, the more weight is going to be on that mud, and it's going to give way and it's going to collapse. So that was the preferred method of building, and it was very limited. You could only go like 1 or 2 stories. And even in New Testament times, most homes, most inexpensive buildings were built that way. They just piled up stones for walls and they packed mud around them. And then they would have kind of I guess you'd kind of call it a thatched roof or something like that. They'd put probably wooden beams across the walls, and then like palm leaves or something, lay those down, and then pack mud on top, and the mud would dry and it would be hard enough that you could walk on it and stuff like that. But again, very limited in the dimensions that you could build a building. So what the people in Babel are talking about now is baking bricks. So they would take some of that soil, they would take some of that sand or dirt, and they would put it in, like they would pack it into forms like blocks, like building blocks, and let it dry. And then they would bake them thoroughly. They would put them in these furnaces. And the bricks in Hebrew are called lavan. Lavan is the root word. It's the word for white. So they would bake them until they were white. So in other words, they would heat that earth, that sand, to a temperature where it would like melt and make like a really solid, hard building block. I'm not describing this very well, but the idea of baking bricks is what made these building blocks so useful. And then it said they also had brick for stone, kind of instead of stone, really, in the place of stones, as I've just described. And they had asphalt for mortar. Chamar is the Hebrew word for that. And the information window at the bottom of our page says that that means tar. So it would be, they probably got this from tar pits. And what they would do is like they would put building blocks in place, and then on top of the building blocks, they would put tar or asphalt, and then lay another block on top of that. And of course, the asphalt would, it had like a sticky adhesive kind of thing. And, it wouldn't dry out and crack and fall away like mud would. So the potential for building enormous structures with this method of baked bricks, fired bricks, and then asphalt for mortar, they were basically unlimited. I mean, they probably could have built a building that was 1,500 miles on each side. They just wouldn't have been able to build it higher than about 14,000 feet. But that's, what is that? 3 miles or so. So anyway, we're talking about a great innovation in building technology. And, with the advance in technology, people, the dreamers, the imaginers are out there coming up with all kinds of ideas for, how we can build stuff that's not necessarily in conformity to God's will and his laws. So they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. In the Dake notes over here, it's got the phrase "may reach." The Dake Bible was based on the King James, the old King James version, and instead of saying "whose top is in the heavens," the King James said "whose top may reach the heavens." And he points out that the words "may reach" are not in the original language. So what does it say? In the Hebrew here, it says, let's build a migdal, which is the word for tower. Rosho, rosh is the head, the suffix, the o suffix, the vav suffix. It's called a holam vav. Means his head or its head, bashamayim, in the heavens. Now, when we talked about the creation story, I mentioned that the word shamayim is usually thought to be plural. So if you look down at the information window, it says that the word shamayim is a common masculine plural absolute noun. But it's actually a dual, which means the heavens are not three or more, but they're dual. There's two heavens. But yet the Bible talks about three heavens. So I think the dualness of the heavens is the earthly sense, the material sense of the earthly creation, the material creation. Then there's a spiritual heaven. So in other words, two of the heavens, the atmosphere around the earth, the first heaven, and outer space where all the stars and planets are, those are material heavens. But the third heaven is a spiritual one, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have a material aspect to it. It doesn't mean that it's not real either. It is real. It's just basically invisible to the human eye. Now, one of the things that you might find interesting is during the early days of the space project, it was before Apollo. What was the first one called? I can't remember. Anyway, like the first 7 that the movie The Right Stuff was made about. This was the first time when this country, America, was planning to shoot spacecraft out higher than the atmosphere of the Earth. These vehicles were going to go more than 1,500 or 1,800 miles from the Earth. And there were scientists in NASA who were afraid that once they got a spacecraft that high, it might crash into the third heaven. It might crash into the Father's house with many mansions. And it may have actually done that, since the third heaven could be spiritual, which would allow a material spacecraft just to pass through it without knowing that. And I've said before, other people think the third heaven is way farther away than that. Other people think it's closer than 1,800 miles away. Some people feel like it's all around us. It's not any higher than Earth is. Some people think it's just high enough that you can reach up your hand and touch it, or somewhere in between, somewhere in the midst of the first heaven. I don't really know exactly where it is. There are some kind of apocalyptic prophecies that describe the third heaven, the place where God lives. And you could get the impression that, like, the ground floor of the third heaven is the top of the Rakia. But I guess we won't go too far into that here. So anyway, whose top is the heavens. As we talked about earlier, this could mean that they thought they could build a building high enough to reach the third heaven. They probably didn't know how high it was, but they were afraid they could do that. If in fact the third heaven is lower than the top of the atmosphere, that could imply that God didn't want them building a building that could actually reach to how high he was. So if the ground floor of the third heaven is somewhere in the midst of the rakia of the atmosphere, they may have actually been able to build it that high, depending on how high the third heaven is. So they said, let us make a name for ourselves. Name is Shem in Hebrew. And it does mean name, but it can also mean like a reputation, become famous. I think that's what they're talking about here. And Shem's name, the son of Noah, his name was Shem. His name was Name. So let us make a name or a reputation for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, this is where they are in direct violation of God's instructions to them after the flood of Noah's Ark. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So spread out and populate the whole planet. God wanted them to do that, and they were reluctant to do it. They wanted to conglomerate. They wanted to kind of gather themselves together around this area of Babylon. And it's like Babylon's going to rule the earth. So verse 5, God came down. The Lord came down to see the city, Babel, and the tower, the Migdal, which the sons of men had built. And Yahweh said, the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, which it doesn't mean there's just one person there, but what it means is they are unified. And we talked about that when we talked about the you know, what? God being three in one, three persons in one Godhead, one divinity, one Yahweh. It's talking about being in harmony with each other. So there are three persons, and they're named in the Bible: the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But they are in harmony. They are one. So yeah, the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, one safa, one lip, which is I guess you'd call that a figurative reference to spoken languages. They all have one. Dake thinks it was Hebrew. Another famous theologian who believes it's Hebrew is John Gill, and he wrote a book. It's on my bookshelf here, but I don't see it right offhand, so I don't want to take the time to grab it. He wrote kind of a dissertation on the Hebrew language, and he was under the impression that the Hebrew language had vowels, like you see them here below the consonant, usually below the consonants. All the little dots and squiggles and things like that, those are the vowels. The bigger letters are the consonants. He believed that there were vowels in the Hebrew language in the time we're talking about now. Let's see. They want a language. And this is what they begin to do, reference to building the tower. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. And that may have concerned God, especially the idea, well, we're not going to scatter abroad like God wants us to. We're going to build this big tower here, and then we'll all worship him or some other gods, Nimrod gods, satanic gods. We'll worship them from this facility. But God wants them spread out. He wants his planet populated. So come, let us go down there and confuse their language. So, okay, this is a little bit confusing in Hebrew, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. The Hebrew word for confuse is navla. Navla. But if you look down at the information window, you will see that the root word is balal. It is, let me see if I can get my pointer down here. Here we have a B and two L's, so it's balal. And that means to mix, to give feed. I guess I have seen it that way. But it means to mix up, or that's where the idea of confusion comes from. Now that's the root word, but this is a form of that. It's a kal imperfect. And I think what has happened here is one of the lamads, one of the L's has dropped out. And because it's an imperfect, you've got a in sound, a noon at the beginning, to make it an imperfect. So in other words, God not only began to a perfect verb in Hebrew is a completed action. Like, what would be an example? Well, Cain killed Abel. That's a completed action. He didn't have to keep killing him. Once he killed him, the deed was done. Case closed. That's a perfect. But an imperfect implies that God was going to start confusing the languages and keep them confused, so that the people, from different regions and different language groups would not be able to communicate with each other. So it would hinder all their plans for building towers and defeating God's purposes and things like that. So navala is what appears in the text. So God's going to confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Now, some people say that that this confusion, this curse of language confusion that God did here, was undone on the day of Pentecost. Because the people were speaking a language that God gave them. They were speaking in tongues, and people from many different language groups could understand them. I'm not too fond of that interpretation, because I mean there were still multiple languages after the day of Pentecost. So that idea really appears in a lot of commentaries. A lot of really good Bible scholars hold that viewpoint. So if you like that, go ahead and run with it. So let's go down and confuse their language. They may not understand one another's speech. So that's going to hinder their plans. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. So it doesn't say here that he destroyed the tower. So I think the image of, like, lightning coming down from heaven and causing the Tower of Babel to collapse, I don't think that's biblical. But it also means that if the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, one of those archaeological remains of a ziggurat in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East, could actually be the archaeological remains of the Tower of Babel. No way of knowing which one, and no way of knowing if there are any remains of the Tower of Babel or whatever. So therefore, its name is called Bavel, or what? Confusion, because there the Lord confused the language of the earth. Now that brings up the question, was that city known as Babylon before the languages were, because Babylon means confusion. Bavel in Hebrew means confusion. So was that the name of the city before the Tower of Babel incident? Or was the, whatever the name of the city was it changed after the confusion? It still could have been called Bavel prophetically, because eventually it was going to be an area that would experience confusion. So therefore, its name is called Bavel. They stopped building the city. So it wasn't only a tower they were building, but it was a city. And the city is called Bavel because there the Lord confused Bavel, the language, the Safa of all the earth. So all the people began to speak different languages. And I don't think that means, like, if there were 1 million people there, it doesn't mean that their languages were confused into 1 million different languages. It just means that suddenly groups of people only understood like one aspect of the Hebrew language, only their portion of it, or their dialect of it. And then there were other people who didn't understand that part, but they understood a different part, something like that. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. Now, the scattering, I don't think that was supernatural. I think it's because, people who could communicate with each other in one of the earth's languages did tend to gravitate towards each other and avoid people they couldn't understand. And so that caused them to, to spread out. And it probably happened gradually. So that is the end of the story of the Tower of Babel, but it's not the end of this chapter. So in this chapter, we get the story of the Tower of Babel. It's the first 9 verses. But you may remember from the chart that the Tower of Babel is in the middle of the chart, and then it shows the dispersion happening after that. And so now the Bible is going to want to focus on this. What is going to follow in verses 10 and following is a genealogy, and it's going to be the genealogy of Shem. Now, the genealogies of the other sons, I think, were given in chapter 10. They may or may not have been, but they're given in some other places in the Bible. But now we're going to focus on Shem because he is the chosen son of Noah to be the one through whom the seed of woman, the Messiah, is going to come. And that red ribbon of redemption or salvation is going to go out from Shem through all of his descendants until we get to the main character of the next chapter. So I won't do the spoiler alert on that one. We'll learn who that is when we get to it. So Shem was 100 years old and begot Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And this was the Bible verse that we used to refute the idea that Noah and his sons had 120 years to build the ark. That's what most commentators say, but the math doesn't work out because Shem is only 100 years old 2 years after the flood. So he was 98 years old after or during the flood. So right there, you know that he had less than 100 years to be working on the ark. And when God commanded Noah to build the ark, Shem was apparently already born and old enough to be married because he had a wife. So what age do you want to make Shem there? If he's 30, then that would give him, what would it be, 68 years, like to build the ark, if my math is correct. But at any rate, Noah and his sons had way less than 120 years to build the ark. So yeah, he was 100 years old, and he begot Arpachshad, which was his son that's in the genealogy. And I'm not going to go into the meaning of these names like we did in Genesis chapter 5. And I don't remember if we did that in 10 or not. I don't think we did, because I don't want to make too much out of that. So Arpachshad is his son. And after he begot Arpachshad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. So if he was 100 years old when Arpachshad was born and he lived another 500 years, that means he was 600 years old when he died. So people are still living very long lifespans after the flood of Noah's Ark. And again, I shared with you, you know, my theory of where the floodwaters came from was that God slowed the rotation of the earth so there would be fewer days and nights in counting people's ages. And the slower rotation of the earth allowed the waters that were above the firmament, which we learned about in Genesis chapter 1, what would it be, verse 3, 4, 5, something around in there, where it talks about the waters above the heavens. And so the earth's rotation slows down and the waters are allowed to fall to the earth. But I'm going to say here, based on the ages of the people in this genealogy, which would be, 10 or so generations, you'll notice that people begin to live less and less. They have less and less longevity. They live fewer and fewer years. So 600 years is a pretty long life, not as long as Methuselah, which was 969 years. So the longevity of people has decreased significantly, but God is not through slowing the rotation of the earth. So Arpachshad lived 35 years and begot Salah. It's actually, the name is actually Shalach, which means to send. So the English doesn't really do it. It should be like S-H-E-L, no, S-H-A-L, A-C-H probably. So Salah. After he begot Salah, Arpachshad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. So 403 plus 35 would be whatever that is. 438. So after he begot Salah, 403 years, and he begot sons and daughters. So just that generation is living considerably less years. Salah lived 30 years and begot Ever. His name is in the yellow in the Hebrew thing, Ever. That is the also the root word for the Hebrew language. So Ever may be, the one who kind of preserved the Hebrew language for the chosen people to speak. And the Middle East is just full of dialects that are similar to Hebrew. Arabic, in fact, is kind of in the same family as Hebrew. And then you've got Ugaritic and, oh man, I don't know what else. Aramaic. So after he begot Ever, Salah lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. So 403 and 30 is 433 years. Ever lived 34 years and begot Peleg. And after he begot Peleg, Ever lived 430 years. So he's like 460 years, and he begot sons and daughters. Peleg, remember, is the guy who the Bible says that during his lifespan, the earth was divided. And I made the suggestion in chapter 10, the video on chapter 10, that that's when the continents divided, which would give credence to the idea that the reason God wanted the people to spread out and not congregate in Babel, well, there are a lot of reasons for it, but one was that he wanted the Western Hemisphere to be populated so that when he divided the continents, there would be people there. And one of the big, question marks in the field of anthropology is how did if humanity had its start in Mesopotamia, which biblically it appears, and also archaeologically, that appears to be the case, how did the people get to the Western Hemisphere? Well, that's one explanation. It's kind of bizarre. It's kind of crazy, but God is able to do crazy and bizarre things. And like when you allow God into the picture, into the context, then nothing really is bizarre and crazy. You spoke the entire universe into existence. After he begot Peleg, Ever lived 430 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years, and he begot Reu. Reu is a Hebrew name that means like a shepherd. It could also mean, it could be a reference to evil, but I'm going to say it's a shepherd. And let me give you a little hint. If you're able to read English and you want to pronounce Hebrew names, don't use, these are called diphthongs or blends. And so in English, this would be like, how would you pronounce that? EU, raw, something like that, re, something like that. It's almost unpronounceable in English. But if you pronounce every separate vowel separately, then you got re'eu, and that is pretty close to the Hebrew, re'eu. Re'u, re'u, re'u. Yep. So that's what you got. So don't do diphthongs in English. Pronounce all the vowels. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. So he's down into the 200s. He lived to be 239 years. Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug. Serug. After he begot Serug, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. So they're living lifespans in the 200s now. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. After he begot Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and begot sons and daughters. So the low 200 years, 230 years. Verse 24, Nahor lived 39 years and begot Terach. It's not really Terah, it's Terach. It should be like Terach, Terach. Some of you may be familiar with the name Terach or Terah in the Bible, because he's the dad of a famous character that is coming up that's going to become the focus of the following chapters. So Nahor gives birth to Terach. After he begot Terach, Nahor lived 119 years. So lifespan is cut in half in that generation. So he lives, what, 119 and 29 would be, what, 138 years, something like that. Begot sons and daughters. Now, Terach lived 70 years and he begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. And I'll bet you recognize this person, Avram. Or maybe you know him better by the name that God will give him later on in his life, Avraham or Abraham. So Terach is the father of Abraham, and Avram's brother, his Ach, Nahor. Nahor is his name. And then you've got the third brother, Haran. Haran. So these are the Abraham, Nahor, and Haran are the three brothers. Terach is the dad. And Terach was 70 years old when he begot at least the eldest of these. And in all likelihood, Abraham is not the oldest. Because he's listed first here, a lot of people think he must have been the firstborn. And if that's the case, Terach was 70 when Abraham was born. But you will find in the genealogies that, like, take the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem was the middle child, but he's listed first because that red ribbon of redemption goes through him. And the red ribbon of redemption is going to go through Terach and Avram rather than his two brothers. So I think in all likelihood, he was not the oldest, but he was the chosen one, a younger one being chosen. Now, let's go over to Dake's notes here. And Dake says the fourth instance of God choosing the younger over the older. Abraham, according to Dake, being the younger, chosen over one of these two who was the oldest son. He's mentioned first here because his history as the father of the Hebrews, the Yivrit, is the subject of this part of Genesis. Terach, he says, was 130 when Avram was born. So the 70 is going to refer to, the 70 years is going to refer to one of these two guys. But where does Dake get the 130 years for the age of Terach when Avram was born? If we go down a couple of more verses, I think we'll find out. This is the genealogy of Terach. Oh, we already did that. Oh, no, we didn't. This is the genealogy of Terach. Terach begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begat Lot. So if you know the story of Abraham, you probably are familiar with Lot, who was his nephew. His brother Haran had a son named Lot, but I think we're going to find that Haran died, and even before his father did. And so Lot became, I don't know, Abraham may have been kind of his guardian or something like that, kind of took charge of Lot, looked after him after his dad died. And Haran lived before his father Terach in his native land. Haran died before his father Terach. So Terach was still alive when his son died. Real tragedy. In his native land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, this is where I wish I had a map so I could show you where Ur of the Chaldeans is. But we'll have a map next time, because we're going to be starting on the story of Abraham, and we'll, look at his various travels in various places in the Middle East there. So we'll see where Ur of the Chaldeans is. If you look on a map, just look where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers empty out into the Persian Gulf. And that is the area where Ur of the Chaldeans were. At least that's one theory. There's another theory that they were up in around where Syria is now, but I don't think many people hold to that. I have a book that holds to it, but I don't think that's right. So anyway, Haran died before his father Terach. So where does the 130 come from? It comes from the story of Abraham being called as God's chosen patriarch when he was 70 or 75 years old. 70 or 75 years old. So if you subtract 70 years from the death of Terach, where does it say? Yeah, let me continue on here, and then we'll do the math. Then Avram and Nahor took wives. The name of Avram's wife was Sarai. And the wife of Nahor's wife, he's the surviving brother, her name was Milcah, the daughter of Haran. Remember, Haran was the brother that died. So Milcah was the daughter of Haran. So Nahor married his cousin, right? No. He married his niece because Haran was his brother. This is all quite confusing. Daughter from the father of Milcah and the father of Ischa. And I don't know who Ischa is. But Sarai was barren. She had no child. And Terach took his son Avram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Avram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. Let's see here. So the days of Terach were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So if we take the date of Haran's death, he was 205 years old, and we subtract the 70 years of age that the Bible attributes to Abraham or Avram when he received his call, and that was 75 years old. If you subtract 75 from 205, you get 70. And that was the age of Terach when he started having sons. So it was either Haran or Nahor that was born when he was 70. And he was 130 when Abraham was born. Then Abraham was 75 years old when Terach died. And that's when he left a place called Haran, not Haran, but Haran, to go to the Promised Land. Okay, that's about the end of chapter 8. Let me give you a blessing from the New Testament today. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Hope we'll see you next time for Genesis chapter 12.